And in many ways, that's indicative of where the Republican voting base is going in French politics, sort of drifting towards the right.
Democracy always includes a form of incompleteness because it is not self-sufficient. The terror during the French Revolution dug an emotional, imaginary, collective void. The king is no longer there. In 2015, the then Minister of Economy Emmanuel Macron gave this remarkable analysis of French politics. The French, ever since the death of Louis the XVIth in 1793, have tried to replace the king. General de Gaulle gave France its current presidential system that essentially grants the electorate the right to crown their own king every 5 years. The heirs of de Gaulle on the right have tried to carry this heavy mantle, but were blindsided in the 2017 presidential election by Macron, even missing out on the runoff for the first time. Nearly 5 years later, the weakened centre-right party Les Républicains tries to parry attacks on all sides. On its left, Emmanuel Macron and his desire to triangulate the right, and on their right, the chef surprise, the nationalist TV polemist turned feisty presidential contender Éric Zemmour, who just held his first public rally this weekend. On Friday as well, Les Républicains have managed to pick their candidate for the 2022 presidential election. The president of a powerful Île-de-France region, Valérie Pécresse. The French right now stands divided into three blocs of comparable size: Pécresse, Zemmour, and Marine Le Pen. I take stock of that situation with Jorge and friend of the show, Julian. If you like the show, you can get more than common decency at Mace Magazine. Mace Magazine is a fantastic publication on British and European politics, and we've been publishing for them some great weekly articles where we build on the key takeaways of our episodes. A great way to dig deeper on the issues we cover. If you like the show and find yourself coming back most weeks to listen, please consider supporting the show for Patreon. We've been doing this on our spare time, and while it's definitely been worth a ride, we've been paying all our physical and digital equipment out of our pockets, and we would love to be able to have extra resources to put together special events or improve our equipment and many other cool projects we have in mind. So, to our patron, thanks a lot. We can't thank you enough for your help. For those of you on the fence, we can't promise you any special content yet. But if enough of you join our Patreon, we will consider adding paid tiers with special content for our patrons and special sessions with our followers. If you can't spare the money, no worries. But as always, you can rate and review on Common Decency on Apple Podcasts. And I can't stress this enough. These reviews really help us a lot to grow on what is a very competitive podcast landscape. And lastly, if you want to get in touch, please continue sending us your comments and questions at undecencypod on Twitter or undecencypod@gmail.com. You should find those links down below in the description. Now, on to the show. So, second French war room on the 2022 election, and there was a big milestone this week, which was the French centre-right primary Les Républicains. Les Républicains is what it remains of the Gaullist party, which has been severely weakened over the past few years after it failed to make the runoff in 2017, leaving Macron and Le Pen dominate the French political landscape since. But they've done a primary nonetheless, a smaller primary than in 2016, when they had 4 million voters, which was huge. This time, they only limited it to people who had a Les Républicains membership. So I think there's only like 113,000 something people who voted. And so the breakdown in the first round gave a lead to Éric Zemmour, the most obviously right-wing candidate on that list. And in second position, at 25%, Zemmour was at 25.6%. At 25%, you've got Valérie Pécresse, who is the president of the Île-de-France region, which includes Paris. And then, at everyone's surprise, Michel Barnier and Xavier Bertrand, who were essentially the two favorites, are 23.9% for Barnier, 22.4% for Bertrand. So it's a very, very, very close thing right here. Essentially, they're all basically at 25%, and in the end, Ciotti got first position, Pécresse the second position. So then they went to a runoff, and the runoff was between Pécresse and Ciotti. The result was not really a surprise, because Pécresse had the support of Michel Barnier. Michel Barnier, of course, being former European Commissioner, being the former Brexit negotiator, and Xavier Bertrand was this kind of very charismatic, I guess, president of the North Île-de-France region. And both Bertrand and Barnier called to vote for Pécresse, and Ciotti, despite having a narrow lead in the first round, got blown apart in the second round with only 39% of the vote, which is pretty good, but in no position to actually win this. Julian, when you hear those results, what's the first thing that comes to mind?
Well, Francois, thank you for having me back on. The most stunning thing for me was the fact that Ciotti, who just was not getting much mention at all in coverage of the French primary, coming in first in the first round. Now, granted, he didn't get the overall nomination, but near 40% in the second round is quite impressive for someone who had been considered, as you say, the most right-wing. And in many ways, that's indicative of where the Republican voting base is going in French politics, sort of drifting towards the right. And his strong performance in both the first and second round shows that that really is the emerging trend. And even when you look at Pécresse's platform, some of the ideas she was putting out there were, quite similar to things that Ciotti had been saying in his campaign. So the results, although so close, there wasn't too much difference in some ways in the policies that people were putting forward to be the leader of the Republican Party for the 22 election. Yeah.
And Jorge, feel free to bounce in. But I want to add something to what Julian just said. Pécresse, mechanically compared to Ciotti, seems like much more of a centrist. She historically has been much more of a centrist politician in general. However, if you look at her platform, she's talking to right-wing LR party members. Therefore, she's going to adapt that platform to those members. And for example, one of her most interesting, I thought, measures in the platform was taking what Denmark has been doing, which is essentially making prison sentences for people in essentially the equivalent of a banlieue in Denmark harsher. Essentially saying, we've got an issue here where people are no longer afraid of the police, no longer afraid of prison, whatever. We need to make sentences harsher in those areas. Now, I'm not sure that's constitutional in France. I really don't think that will work out. But it's just kind of one of those symbols that the party has run on a very right-wing platform. Even Barnier, we talked about Barnier a lot last year. Barnier had a small moratorium on immigration. So yeah, the race was very much to the right of the LR party.
I do want to quickly point out that Francois does deserve some credit for this, because just before the first round of the election, I asked him who he thought was going to come in first, and he did say Éric Zemmour. So we will probably have to ask you for another prediction towards the end.
Well, okay. On predictions, I have to say I've said a lot of good things, but a lot of terrible things. I predicted something like Zemmour. I predicted Ciotti. But I also said a month ago I thought Barnier would win, so I'm not always right in my predictions. So I don't know.
I do have a question for you though, in terms of Pécresse's candidacy now as the Republican nominee, because a lot of the attacks coming in, whether before from Zemmour saying the Republican primary is the race to be Macron's prime minister. I think Le Pen described her as the most Macroniste of all the candidates running in the Republican primary, and you're seeing some articles from centre-right figures describing her as the pro-business moderate in the party. Does that stick, or will her policy positions, which are to the right of where I think people are describing her in loose and general terms, will it stick as her being as this pro-business moderate who's of the centre-right, or will this tilt to the more harder line conservative right wing of the Republican Party, will that be her lane, and will she be able to lock down that lane?
Wow, that's a good question, Julian. I think as long as the campaign goes on, she will have to stick to that kind of very right-wing messaging. Does not mean she can't also identify herself as a pro-business, centre-right moderate. I don't think those positions are seen as incompatible by the centre-right electorate. If you look at, for example, Fillon, who became massively popular within not just the Les Républicains core base, but the kind of larger right-wing base, he was essentially on the same platform as Pécresse. Very strict on immigration, very strict on crime, very strict on Islamism, but also very openly pro-business. So in that sense, he could have been a kind of centre-right moderate, like many other centre-right moderates we've seen who are kind of more economically liberal than conservative socially. That said, I think the moment if she loses, I believe she will go back to holding much more moderate positions. I think that's something you always see within the kind of centre-right politicians is they have very right-wing platforms during elections and then become much more moderate after that. And I think one of the good examples for that might be Michel Barnier. Michel Barnier just lost. He burnt a lot of political capital by doing this. He jeopardized a lot of his relationship with Brussels over his moratorium on immigration and the rest of it. And I suspect now he's going to try and hold kind of much more centrist positions on the EU, on immigration, on the rest of it. I just really like this. On Michel Barnier, I think it's important to talk about him because at some point we said on this program we thought he would win because he had a real good momentum. A lot of parliamentarians liked him. He hadn't left Les Républicains like Valérie Pécresse or Xavier Bertrand. He stayed in the party until the end. And so you could expect the LR core membership to reward him for this fidelity. But I really like the comparison of Brexit as a French Revolution. It's kind of ever-increasing radicalization where you get les États généraux that kicks off a French Revolution is essentially the Brexit referendum, and then you lose David Cameron, the king, and then there's kind of a vacuum in which the most radical right-wing party members seem to hold a kind of veto on everything. And the once revolutionaries become moderates and become guillotined politically. But what way I think this comparison works really well is also the relationship a lot of Remainers had to their own country and to the EU. So, for example, when during the French Revolution, you had all the French nobles emigre who left, especially for London actually, they left to London, and they would wish with all their heart the defeat of revolutionary France. They believe revolutionary France deserved to be punished for the crime of killing the king, for the crime of kicking him out, for the crime of being Republican, and so on and so on. And so they wished the victories of the armies of Austria, the armies of Prussia against France. And I think to some extent, there's a lot of kind of elite Remainers ended up doing the same. They ended up wishing the victories of the EU over Theresa May. I'm not sure if you remember, but all those summits in Brussels, time after time, you would have Theresa May getting humiliated by the EU, and she would come back empty-handed to London, and the kind of Remainer elites would kind of feel somewhat happy about it, vindicated at least. In that optic, Michel Barnier is an Austrian general. He was seen as one of them. He was seen as a person who would right the wrongs and show Brexit Britain how wrong they were. And when he comes back to France, the first thing he says is, "I want a moratorium on immigration." Now, I heard that Lord Frost, the alter ego of Barnier on the British side, said, "I didn't know I robbed on him that much with my ideas for the Brexit negotiations." But it's a real sign of how strong the feeling of betrayal was in Brussels. Now he lost that capital in Brussels. He's not going to become the next French president. it's a tough time for Michel Barnier.
David Frost's only victory in the Brexit talks,
Exactly.
probably, or one of the few.
Yeah.
I think, there's maybe, I think there still are, given his experience both at the European level and then as a figure of national prominence within France, he is the sort of person who you could see landing in a cabinet post. And maybe this is me spending too much time in the United States and already projecting for future cabinets. But, Macron is obviously someone who is talks a lot about strategic autonomy, and given Barnier's depth of relationships with the European Union, and also crucially, he does know the key figures in the United Kingdom, and as much as the relations between Britain and France are quite poor, he does at least know the people on the other side, and you could see a role for him as someone in the foreign ministry or in a broader portfolio on French geopolitics, given his breadth of international experience and the personal relationships that he has. So I don't think his career is quite over, but it's certainly, one nail away.
Yeah, and I want to stress this because the campaign was very much to the right of Les Républicains. But a lot of these figures, especially Barnier, Pécresse, you could very well imagine in a Macron second presidency. Maybe as PM, maybe as foreign affairs for Barnier or something like that. So that's something to take into account. And I think LR party members know this. I was shocked to see so many, look at Gérald Darmanin, for example. Gérald Darmanin is the Minister for the Interior right now for Macron. He was Sarkozyist. He was one of the most right-wing Sarkozysts within Sarkozy's wing. And he joined Macron. And there's been so many people who've been identified to the right of LR who ended up joining Macron or begging Macron to give him a position over the past 5 years. Some of them being borderline pathetic, actually. But I think LR party members know that they can't be sure these people won't join Macron in a year's time. And I think that psychologically, that is very damaging. Two things. I think that's a conversation I had with Julian actually a few months ago about how the right is very politically pragmatic. It kind of reads the spirit of a time, the zeitgeist, really well. And if you take, for example, Jacques Chirac, who was the great Gaullist candidate from the 70s to the early 2000s, he essentially always adapted to the spirit of a time. I think in the late 70s, he wanted the Gaullist party to become a great Labour Party in the mold of perhaps what you could see in the UK. He was also a huge fan of Reagan and Thatcher in the 80s. And then in 1995, he ran as a kind of basically a centre-left candidate again. So it's very opportunistic, but I think what we're seeing for nowadays with kind of political realignment within the Conservative Party in the UK shows us how pragmatic centre-right parties tend to be. It's more kind of a general understanding of the world than a kind of set of policies that they need to stick to all the time. I will say the kind of social Gaullist candidate in the race was Xavier Bertrand, I think. I think Xavier Bertrand, he is the president of the Île-de-France northern region. So historically, you think of coal mines, you think of the industrial workers, you think all of that. So I think he was that kind of candidate, whether it was sincere or whether it was some kind of posturing. I think he wanted to be that candidate. But I think I'm right. Also, something we have to realize is the electorate in France is 40 to 45% pensioners. And pensioners, where they act like shareholders, essentially. They're the shareholders of the French companies, if so you want to speak. And so they want to make sure they will keep getting their shares, they will keep getting their money month after month, their pensions. And therefore, they're terrified by the increasing debt. They are terrified by all that public spending because they are afraid the French company would go bankrupt, in which case they will lose everything. So that's why I think, especially the centre-right electorate is very old. Very old. They have to they're not going to win on the kind of social stuff. Maybe they'll win on the social stuff on pensions, but they're not going to win on the social stuff more generally because centre-right voters are terrified by the mounting debt. They're terrified by France not having a budget in the green since the 60s. So you're not going to win on that. As much as I think it's an important mix to have within the Gaullist party, that kind of social Gaullism, I do not think it is a vote winner. It is for Le Pen maybe, but not for the Gaullists.
So I just wanted to pick up on this strand about Gaullism because I read an article, I think it was a couple of months ago for the anniversary of his death, I believe, on how all French politicians now in some way try to claim the mantle of de Gaulle, including even Le Pen, who, although she will say I'm not a Gaullist because of his stance on Algeria, she'll still visit various World War II sites, claiming him as the liberator of France and the voice of an independent France, and claiming those nationalist tones whilst also conveniently separating herself from her father, who obviously loathed de Gaulle. But Francois, as someone who is a young Frenchman, is there a generational divide in terms of the way people reminisce about de Gaulle? And the comparison I'm going to use is for in the United States, or even actually in the United Kingdom, where you have young conservatives today who don't remember the Thatcher eras, pining for Thatcher. And indeed, many Republicans today who some will look back on, let's say, the Reagan era, and then Democrats who might look back wistfully on Kennedy and Johnson and FDR even. Is there the same thing for young French voters with de Gaulle, who probably stands out in terms of national prominence a bit more than some of those figures I just named?
Yeah, as you said, it's hard to compare Ronald Reagan and de Gaulle because de Gaulle is kind of a historical figure that dominates French politics to an extent that is impossible for someone who hasn't been a war hero like de Gaulle.
Do you want to restart?
So I think he is still overarching. I do think a lot of people forget how divisive de Gaulle was when he was president. Abandoning Algeria to the Algerians seems like sound policy nowadays. But back then, it was hugely controversial, especially among the kind of right-wing figures who would have been his support base, especially at the beginning. Hugely controversial. He was called a caudillo, he was called a Mussolini, he was called a borderline fascist by the left, because he was a general, because he basically came back to power through a masked disguised coup in 1958. He essentially threatened, he suggested to the president of the Fourth Republic that if nothing happened, maybe a coup would happen, and nudge, nudge, wink, wink, and therefore he ended up coming back to power. But he, I think, remains this kind of overarching figure to the left, on the right. But nowadays, everybody is a Gaullist, as you say. To the left, I think the only people who will say I'm not a Gaullist are on the far left. I think that's the only one who will say I'm not a Gaullist, people on the far left. Pretty much.
Yeah, I mean, that makes a lot of sense. And I suppose, I know we're talking a little bit about the right, but I suppose now would be a good time to sort of talk about the state of the left in French politics nowadays. Jorge, I don't know if you have something to add on that.
Could we go back to the left later, actually? Can we just do Zemmour and then go back to the kind of go back to the left? I think it's a better flow to go from. Sorry, we'll delete this, but to go from the right to Zemmour.
Do you want me to come back in on my pivot?
Just ask something like. You can go ahead.
So obviously, all these candidates talking about the legacy of de Gaulle, and we've talked a bit about the rightward drift. What do you think explains this rightward shift in French politics and the fact that it's created space for everybody's favorite topic, Éric Zemmour, on the right to challenge Le Pen on the far right and potentially sort of squeeze out the Republicans on that side too?
Yeah. Well, I think first of all, people have to realize France has become a very, very right-wing country. I'm not even going to enter the debate of is Macron a right-wing president. I think he might be to some extent, but even ignoring that conversation and considering Macron is a kind of centrist. If we look at Le Pen, plus Zemmour, plus Pécresse, plus smaller candidates, we make it roughly around 40 to 45% of the electorate. And then a lot of Macron voters are former right-wing voters. So France is a very right-wing country. If you actually look at the polls of the past 15 years on immigration, people have essentially been saying the same thing for a decade and a half, which is immigration too much, stop. Sometimes in kind of much more radical terms than this. If you look at another recent poll, which was done, I think, a month ago, on the famous or infamous grand remplacement, great replacement theory, which is the idea that some elites are getting people from the outside, replacing the native population. I think 65% of the electorate fears the grand remplacement. 61% believes in the grand remplacement, but 65% fears it. And this includes some 45% of Green voters. So I think if you want to understand why there's such a right-wing push right now in France, it's because the opinion has shifted completely. Now, whether it's just the reality of France, the events in France that is creating that shift, or whether it is the influence of some ideologues, some authors, that is an open conversation. And this is where Zemmour comes in. Zemmour, for the past 15 years, has been within the nuclear reactor of the press, of the media, and he's been able, from that kind of position, to add all his ideas one after the other. On immigration, on assimilation, on terrorism. He has always had this very staunch, hard right line, which had been parroted for a long time over the past, especially over the past few months, by LR, by Le Pen. Now all of a sudden he thinks people will prefer the original to the copy. So he comes in, and we talked about Zemmour a few weeks ago. I highly recommend people go to listen to that episode. It's a really good insight on Zemmour. We published it. We recorded it before Zemmour announced his candidacy, but I think a lot of the analysis on who he is, on his ideas, haven't changed a single bit since. Now, Zemmour started really strong. He went from essentially 5% in polls at the start of the summer to a peak of roughly 17% in mid-October. That is a huge leap for any candidate. No pollsters had something so meteoric, so fast, so strong. However, he has slightly started to dip in polls. Now Le Pen looks like the likely of the two far-right candidates to make it to the second round. He can still come back. We're recording this on a Sunday. We're going to release this Wednesday, as always. And Zemmour right now is preparing his great Villepinte meeting in a huge room. There should be apparently 15,000 people, something like that. So it's going to be a huge rally. He announces his candidacy through a video clip, which I'm sure a lot of you have seen or heard about, where he essentially reads a well-written text and goes through history and saying, we need to take back the country. We need to be, perpetuate the legacy of de Gaulle, of Jeanne d'Arc, of the Lumière brothers who invented cinema, and so on and so on. France is on the brink of chaos, and we need to do something about it. And it was very much modeled on de Gaulle's 18th of June call from Britain on the BBC for French to join the resistance. But he's at a make or break moment. I think he started to fall. The reason I think he started to fall is people liked the idea of having a maverick in the race. People liked the idea of someone coming in and just wrecking the established scenario. They were unhappy with the idea that Macron Le Pen was guaranteed, and they saw Zemmour as their tool, their weapon to destroy that duopoly on French politics.
Yeah, so it's almost ironic that we transitioned from our prior segment talking about de Gaulle and whether he remains a popular figure among France's youth, and you mentioned Julian that obviously people on the far right have been sort of lukewarm on de Gaulle's legacy, primarily because of Algeria, and this is where Zemmour really comes in, and I think that his life story and his particular sort of background or identity, call it what you will, is very interesting, and it's not being covered nearly enough. I think that I haven't heard many journalists sort of having an interest in the fact that he's a Jewish Pied Noir from Algeria, and that obviously how that has shaped his worldview. I mean, when you look at the video of the campaign launch video, what you see is Zemmour is someone who is incredibly indebted to France. He feels like an incredible debt of gratitude to the country that gave him everything. It gave him economic prosperity. It gave him social cohesion. It gave him culture. It gave him literature. So he feels like he's incredibly indebted to this country that gave everything. And where I think that his Pied Noir background is relevant is that his family, again, his great grandparents may have been made French citizens by the Crémieux decree, this law in 1870 that turned the Jews of Algeria into French citizens. And I keep hearing from people both from France and Algeria that I've been talking to over recent weeks that his worldview is that of a standard Pied Noir. I mean, these people were hardened nationalists before and after the war. And I don't think that he said much about Algeria, but I think that every one of his campaign pronouncements is, if only indirectly, a statement about his indebtedness to France as an Algerian Jew.
So this is something we didn't talk about in our conversation with Elisabeth Moutet and John Litchfield on Zemmour. But what is interesting is actually when he was a young man, he started on the left politically. His first election was, I think, 1970s. He voted for the left. His first presidential election, he voted for François Mitterrand. And he was a left-wing voter for a long time. Again, that's what he says. But he says the pivot happens in l'affaire de Creil. L'affaire de Creil is, I think, in 1989, when a group of young teenagers went to school wearing a veil in class. That created huge national controversy. 15 years later, in 2004, we would have a law saying you could not have ostentatious religious signs in school. But back then, the left was very uncomfortable with this topic. And Lionel Jospin, who was a minister back then on education, I think, said the most important thing was not to stigmatize these young girls. And Zemmour says, at that moment, I understood that the model I went through, the model of assimilation, which made me the son of Algerian Jews, Berber, into true Frenchmen. And he said that process, which generations of Spaniards, of Italians went through, he understood would be abandoned. And he says that was kind of a pivotal moment in his political understanding of world. So I think it's interesting to see that he hasn't always been this kind of, you say he's got a standard worldview of a Pied Noir, which is true to some extent, but he didn't always have that worldview. And I think it's important to think of that. Something else I want to talk about is Zemmour's dip a little bit, because he was doing really well. When we were doing an episode with Elisabeth Moutet and John Litchfield, he was riding high on the top of sky-high polls, which seemed to predict him a runoff against Macron. Now he's a few points behind Le Pen. He's lost a lot of momentum. And there's a few reasons to explain that. Again, as I said, people liked him because he was a weapon they found to destroy the Le Pen-Macron runoff. But all of a sudden, maybe too quickly for Zemmour's liking, he became a front runner, which meant people were starting to think, actually, do I think this guy could become president? And to have listened to him a lot, it seems like he hasn't completely made that pivot from author, from journalist to politician. When you listen to him, sometimes it feels like he is on a CNews talk show and just talking as he always do in a kind of very intelligent, based on history and all things that make Zemmour popular. He still has that kind of identity. But it's not clear to me he has made that pivot to become a politician. So again, he's going to have his rally this Sunday, and maybe he's going to be the best speaker since Jacques Chirac. Who knows? I somewhat doubt it. But he hasn't made that pivot. And secondly, there's been a lot of kind of strange amateurism in the Zemmour side. There's a lot of young people around him, very generous with their time, who's putting a lot of effort. But there's been a lot of kind of unforced errors. It was actually, on a more funny side, he made a communique after Cioty's defeat in which he said, Éric Ciotti, tough luck. You fought well, and you deserve a better fate. I think you showed there's a lot of people within the LR who don't want another centrist like Pécresse, yada, yada, yada. But the first version of that communique he published on Twitter was, the lorem ipsum, the kind of base text you get for formatting. Essentially, someone posted the raw version where there was no text by Zemmour. They published the lorem ipsum straight on Twitter. And they corrected it. But there's small things like that. Then there was this famous trip to Marseille. He wanted to go to Marseille. He wanted to talk to people in Marseille, essentially saying, look at Marseille. It's being really destroyed by criminality, by Islamism, by drug trafficking, and so on and so on. And I think the organization wasn't up to it. Now, it wasn't up to it partly because there's a lot of amateurism, and I don't think it was organized well enough, but also because, and I think that's something few other candidates will have to deal with, he has been attacked by Antifa, not just online, but physically. He has a police protection for past 5 or 6 years because of the threats to his life by Islamism. But more generally, the Antifa have made his life hell. So he went to a restaurant in Marseille, and like hours later, people ransacked the restaurant in Marseille. Some right-wing journalists who were covering Zemmour got attacked by Antifa. They took help. The Antifa took their bike helmets and smashed it on the head of one journalist.
Was this Livre Noir?
Yeah, this is the Livre Noir people. Yeah. So there's a real issue, which is he had to drop off not at Marseille but at Aix because he knew there would be a huge welcome committee by the Antifa in Marseille, and so he couldn't go on. There's a real issue right now, especially for foreign candidates, with kind of a rise in aggressive, violent Antifa mobilization, which has made Zemmour's campaign hard. But on top of that, there's also been a lot of surprising amateurism.
I think one element of Zemmour's campaign, the fact that he is running as an outsider without an established party, I think I know political parties get mocked a lot as being elite clubs where you go to champagne dinners and talk about high philosophy, and in reality, you're not really doing too much. But they are very important for running elections because you get the national infrastructure and you get, importantly, as you point out, the expertise of how to do a communications operation. And I think one underappreciated element of Macron's campaign in 2017 is that he launched his movement, as he called it then, quite early. I believe it was either 2016 or 2015, but it was 2016. So he had a full year of laying the political infrastructure and the campaign infrastructure and getting the right people on board and getting a message sorted by professional communication staff before he announced his candidacy. Whereas Zemmour, yes, he's a TV presence. Yes, he knows how to animate an audience from a studio, but he doesn't have that campaign infrastructure that you need, especially if you're trying to take on established parties, which is what he's aiming to do.
Two things on that. He's going to announce today his party and the name of his party. It's not clear what the party name is going to be, but I know the kind of logo will be an olive branch for peace, but also because Zemmour in Berber means olive tree, I think. It means olive tree. So that's the first thing. He's going to announce his party. He doesn't have a party, but he has this kind of de facto party organization around him, which was called Les Amis d'Éric Zemmour, which was kind of a proto-party for him when he was still officially not running. And I want to say something about what you just said, about how Macron surrounded himself early. He surrounded himself early, but in the end, the people he had to use, for just especially like for to become MPs, people working in his campaign, also being somewhat amateurish. And what struck me actually in Valérie Pécresse's speech after she won the primary was how she made her professionalism and the professionalism of people around her a key asset. Now, to be fair, I thought her post-victory speech and her post-first round speech she made were very uninspiring. I thought it was pretty bland. But maybe people, after 5 years of La République En Marche MPs looking like they didn't really know what they were supposed to do, maybe people will be happy to get kind of old school politicians back into the job. The other thing I think Zemmour is going to struggle is, unlike Macron, who had kind of, let's say, friendly coverage in the press, because, the new look centrist, the new Tony Blair, he's young, he's handsome, yada, 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 he's a centrist. Zemmour is not going to get any help from the press. He famously flipped off a woman in Marseille. He's in his car, flips off. He became an international meme within minutes of the woman flipping off Zemmour and Zemmour flipping her off back. But what is interesting in that whole thing is the media talked about this Zemmour flipping off and being very unpresidential, and that's 100% something you should talk about. But nobody in the national press, except for kind of Valeurs Actuelles, a kind of right to far right magazine, talked about the weekend where Antifas were attacking journalists, were attacking the restaurants in which he was eating, having lunch. Nobody was talking about that. And I think Zemmour just has to tough it up. I think he has to accept that he's not going to get any help from the media. And I think if he wants to have a chance of winning this, he's going to have to go full Trump. He's going to have to go full, the media is our enemy. He's going to have to be very aggressive on that. I'm not sure it's very healthy for democracy, but I don't think he will find a better way for him to make his case than attacking the media, which is also very unpopular in France as of now.
And I think additionally to that, if you're not getting help from traditional media, then you need to be extremely digitally savvy and harness all the channels of social media to get your message across. In many ways, it's a way of circumventing the traditional press. And I think, there's so much documented now on Twitter's algorithm and Facebook's algorithm that it's very much open for someone with his firebrand politics to really make a splash and expand the reach of his message using social media. Mm-hmm. And, if he has the right advisors in place and the right strategy around it, that could be his way of breaking through and sort of breaking this slump that he's in, because where, Le Pen has been around and campaigning for president for what feels like decades. Zemmour, this is his first go at it, and he can probably, he's fresh. I say fresh air for a 70-year-old, but yeah, he is a fresh voice on the presidential election circuit.
I also want to talk a little bit about his video. I think it's worth listening to kind of understand where Zim was coming from and what kind of animates it. But there's also another interesting issue with that video. It essentially got shadow banned on YouTube, meaning that if you typed Zemmour video candidat, something along those lines, you wouldn't be able to find it. You'd be able to find the press talking about it, but you wouldn't be able to find it directly, despite the fact I think it's like a 2.5 million views or something like that, something completely absurd like that. 2.5, maybe 3 million now, I have no idea. It keeps rising. Then on top of that, YouTube decided that you would only be able to access it if you can prove you're 18 or older, which means either giving credit card details or kind of some kind of ID. I think he's not going to be... I'm pretty sure there's going to be a moment where a social media platform decides Zemmour is too dangerous for our brand, we can't accept it. Maybe Twitter, maybe YouTube, or something like that. It's going to be interesting to follow, because we all remember what happened to Trump's Twitter account after the Capitol Hill insurrection. And I think something like that might just happen in France. And that's something to follow, because what we saw with the YouTube video was a kind of heavy-handed approach already to limit the influence of Zemmour. And yes, Zemmour has to use these social media platforms, but also the social media platforms are very uncomfortable with politicians. It does not like using them as an asset. And that's something he's going to have to be very keenly aware of.
And in many ways, that could aid his case, especially if it's... Yeah. I mean, with Trump after the attempted insurrection and also just 4 years of him saying whatever he felt like on Twitter, I think with Zemmour in the run-up to an election, it becomes a bit more, if you get banned as you're running for president, then I think that attack line becomes more potent. because you're saying, look, they're trying to silence my voice and shut me out of this race. They're trying to silence your voice by doing that.
Yeah.
But I mean, with Trump, he'd already lost. He just was too delusional to accept it.
Yeah, he was a lame duck, so they didn't mind getting rid of him anyways. That's a fair point. I want to pivot to the kind of larger landscape of the election, because we talked a lot about the right. Just reminder for everyone, Macron right now is at 24%, 25% of the electorate. He is pretty much, as of now, guaranteed a runoff spot. The question is against who? And if he faces Le Pen or Zemmour, he is looking in a strong position to win. He actually has a weaker performance against Le Pen than against Zemmour. So we'll have to see how this evolves. But that is something that is weakening Zemmour's case, which is, Le Pen can't win. But if you say Le Pen can't win and she is outperforming you in a runoff against Macron, that kind of blunts your case. But let's pivot a little to the left. So we said the right, excluding Macron, was at roughly 45%. If you include Macron, we are now at 60%. And if you look at kind of the main left-wing parties here, 70% with Macron. I knew I got my math wrong here. 70%. The right plus Macron is 70%. If you look at all the left-wing candidates, we've got Mélenchon roughly at 9%, Jadot, the Green candidate, 8%, Hidalgo, the Socialist Party candidate, 5%. Then you get the Communist Party at 2%. Then you get kind of other fringe candidates at 1%, 2%. If you're being generous, it's like 25% of the electorate that is going to vote for a left-wing candidate. This is a very dire situation. Now, a lot of left-wing candidates have roughly similar platforms. The Greens and the Socialists, it's not a huge difference. Mélenchon is a bit more different because he's a lot more anti-European than the other two, but even then, the militant bases, the party bases of all these different candidates feel they have a lot in common. And right now, they are completely dispersed in 3 different major candidacies, none of them breaking 10% as of now. So the question, of course, would be, you're all 9, 8, 5%. Why don't you guys unite? Why don't you guys stick together? Especially because with Zemmour in the running, what Zemmour is doing is he's artificially lowering the threshold to make it to the second round. Because had it just been Le Pen Macron, the ticket for runoff would have been at 25%, which is huge. But with Zemmour, the ticket for runoff might just be 19%, 20, 18%. That is completely doable if the left unites and stick together. Now, can they win a runoff against Macron? I don't think so. Can they win a runoff against Zemmour? Maybe, but it's going to be a tough job. The question is, will they stick together?
Well, I don't think anyone who's ever spoken to someone who's a member of a left-wing political party would tell you that the left is particularly good at sticking together or rallying behind one voice when it's needed. And, we look at it, if you're looking at those numbers, even the variation in the candidates, I mean, Mélenchon in 2017, he did quite well with 19% in that first round.
Yep.
Obviously, he's a bit lower now. But the difference between Mélenchon and Hidalgo is quite broad. It's quite a large gap to bridge. And his record as a politician in France is not someone who's going to make the grand compromise, the grand bargain on the left to try and shut out these voices on the right and just get someone who is somewhat aligned into that second round. So although, tactically it would be a good thing for the followers of left-wing politics in France, it's just not likely with the nature of the characters that are aligned on that side of the political spectrum.
I think what you might... I agree with you. There's a big difference between Mélenchon and Hidalgo. But I want to nuance that by saying there is not a huge difference between the Hidalgo voter and the Mélenchon voter. And this is my point. I don't think a de jure alliance is feasible. I think maybe Hidalgo, if she continues dropping in polls, she's at 5%, which is really not great. She might end up supporting the Green Party, but even that, I'm not sure, because I'm not sure the Socialist Party would be able to swallow that pill. But what I'm saying is the people who vote for Mélenchon, the people who vote for Jadot, and the people who vote for Hidalgo aren't that far away ideologically, especially now that they are so kind of, they understand they are, their political clout has dropped so much, it kind of tightens them together. What might happen is rather than an alliance through the top, a de jure alliance through the top, you might have a de facto alliance from the bottom, where at some point, one of the three starts getting a clear lead over the rest. And there is going to be a snowballing effect of tactical voting, which is exactly what happened in the 2017 presidential election, where you had Benoît Hamon, the socialist candidate, and Jean-Luc Mélenchon, the far left France Insoumise candidate, who were neck and neck for a long time. And then at some point, Mélenchon started getting the lead. And then you get a snowballing tactical voting effect. And in the end, Hamon and Mélenchon, who were neck and neck, end up at very different positions, with Hamon being at 6% and Mélenchon being at 19%. This might just be the left's best chance at making a runoff. One of the three, he's not going to get everyone, because some people, will not accept Mélenchon, will not accept Hidalgo, will rather vote for their convictions rather than vote tactically, all of those things. But the best chance of the left to make it to the runoff is a snowballing tactical vote.
And I think you could see that with, as you point out with Hidalgo and Jadot, if they can find the right issues to frame their campaign around. So, the right's talking about national sovereignty, which comes in many stripes and forms in terms of borders and relationship with the European Union. If one of those candidates on the left is able to frame the debate around a particular issue and then generate momentum on that. So for the Green Party, obviously it's going to be climate, it's going to be energy. All the candidates from the Republican Party are pledging to build nuclear reactors. That's something you could challenge them on, but by pivoting and saying we want to do it, but with more safer renewable energy sources. I know we've talked about nuclear energy in the past, but that's something that Jadot could potentially own. And given at least for Hidalgo, she's the mayor of Paris. I don't know too much about the voting blocks within the Socialist Party. Fully confess to that, but that's something that, as a Green, perhaps I'm being more ambitious about the Greens because they've recently gone into government in some other countries around Europe. But I think that's something they could really push and potentially get that momentum, as you say. And then with debates coming up, if they are able to establish themselves as the lead voice on that side, you can get that snowball effect and potentially get to, I think 19 is still a lot, but I think to 15% would still be pretty good, especially if the right is fractured.
I think generally the left struggles to impose its themes. You talked about climate, which is a good example. The Greens are ferociously anti-nuclear, always have been. It's part of kind of political tradition of those parties. The issue is the narrative on nuclear has changed completely in the past 3 years. And that's why Macron went from being, somewhat anti-nuclear to fervently pro-nuclear. The narrative has completely changed. People have understood that. They looked at Germany leaving nuclear, relying a lot more on gas, a lot more on coal, and importing French nuclear energy. So people are like, okay, renewables isn't in the short term going to be able to pick it up, especially because it is not a controllable energy. You cannot trust the sun or the wind to blow all the time at the same speed, at the same intensity. And so the Greens are saying we want to talk about climate, but they're going to have nuclear as their Achilles heel on this. They could talk about kind of social issues. A lot of French people are kind of worried about we will call in France le pouvoir d'achat, essentially living conditions. Is my money going to allow me to afford, a bit of fun, enough food for every month? Am I going to be worried, the 25th of a month about the rest of the week or something? So they might be able to talk about this, but it's not easy because this is where Zemmour is very strong. Is he's capable a bit exactly like Trump, because through bombast, through very aggressive comments, to make a theme so strong that everybody has to comment on it. Because if you don't, the journalist in front of you will say, well, Éric Zemmour just said this about immigration, what do you think? And then all of a sudden you have to talk about immigration, which is a topic you didn't want to talk about because it's a topic which you're not comfortable with. You'd rather be talking about wages, you'd rather be talking about energy, you'd rather be talking about climate, you'd rather be talking about wages in the public sector.
Yeah, it's very tricky. I mean, I'm sort of thinking about the West Wing of you've got to get the pivot right, but a lot of times the press simply won't let you pivot to the issue that you want to talk about because they want to cover what's hot. And especially, now with social media,
exactly.
You're constantly being distracted by whatever is the whatever's trending on Twitter. What's the hot topic of the day? This is why no journalist should be
trending on Twitter.
That's another debate.
Yeah.
I did want to ask one question because
Yeah.
if we're sort of looking at, since the Hollande presidency, the last time the left was truly in power, I'm not going to call Macron a leftist because I know I'll get flayed alive on Twitter. I saw an article recently talking about why, in large part, why France is having so many strong right-wing voices and so many conservatives of national prominence. And the point that this article made, and to bring it slightly back to our conversation about de Gaulle earlier, is that in the 50s and the 60s, France had this incredible bench of left-wing intellectuals. Sartre, Camus, de Beauvoir. Now, obviously, there is a Camus around today, but he's on the right. And those intellectual voices of the left just aren't there. And that's given a lot of space for candidates on the right to really dominate the intellectual discussions of French politics. And this arguably could be a wider problem that you're seeing across Europe and other countries as well. But I wanted to specifically talk about France because of such a strong intellectual tradition there.
Yeah, it's true. There's been a dearth of kind of public intellectuals in French politics for a little while. Some of them still exist. I want to talk about, for example, Raphael Glucksmann, who I'm not sure we could call an intellectual. He was kind of a journalist, intellectual journalist maybe, who essentially became a Socialist Party MEP. So there's a few of them left, but they really don't have the same sway on public opinion. Even kind of more moderate intellectuals. There's one intellectual, I think he's, I think we can call him intellectual, is Jérôme Fourquet. He is a pollster who's been writing some very interesting books on French society, French culture, through the study of polls. But even the kind of conclusions of his stuff has been kind of very right-wing leaning. So it's I agree. But in a comfortable situation where there's a lack of public intellectuals on the left, I'm not sure why. Maybe the legacy of Bourdieu, Deleuze, Derrida is just so heavy to carry that no one really wanted to carry the mantle. I think maybe also the left has kind of chosen different means to spread their ideas. NGOs, I think we talked about NGOs recently. A lot of kind of left-wing politicians and activists really see NGOs as the best way to defend their ideas through trials, through the judiciary, through activism. But yeah, I agree. There's a lack of left-wing intellectual at the moment. Jorge, you're in a hotbed of left-wing intellectualism, so let us know.
Yeah, and I don't want to keep us on here for too long, but I think it's a really interesting point. In fact, I'm very curious also to see where whether the sort of the hard the big intellectuals of the moment here in France, whether they're going to come in and make an impact on the election. I think you've seen Bernard-Henri Lévy do that. Mm-hmm. He came out and with a big essay on Tablet magazine, which is a Jewish magazine in the States, calling out Éric Zemmour and essentially saying he's a fellow Jew, but you shouldn't trust him. Yeah. But I'm really curious about the other ones, people like Alain Finkielkraut, mm-hmm. who for many years has been veering to the right. I mean, he now is very much critical of mass immigration. Yeah. He's very concerned about the state of assimilation in France. Or what about someone like Michel Onfray, who is nominally on the left, but in effect he's very much sort of a populist and a sovereignist. Yeah. So he's been building. I think his magazine now is very much a sort of an overarching magazine for both sovereignists on the left and on the right. So I'm really curious to see where these intellectuals are going to be coming in from in terms of this race. I think they certainly don't want to see Zemmour win, but they're not particularly progressive either.
No.
I mean, certainly not Alain Finkielkraut.
No, I think you're right. I think there's what's interesting, as you said, Onfray, Finkielkraut. There's a lot of intellectuals in the public debate who came from the left and then progressively moved to the right. And I think in the case of Finkielkraut, I think what is interesting is, I think the Cresse affair, which we talked early on, which was one of the kind of moments where France realized there was going to be a assimilation issue with young women coming in veils in teenage schools, and teenagers coming to school with veils. And that's when Zemmour kind of flipped from the left to the right. And I think it also played a large role in Finkielkraut's thinking. It was very much a kind of post-68 left-wing intellectual when he started. Right.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, I think that's a good place to stop at. Thanks a lot to all of you. Don't forget, if you like the show and if you find yourself coming back every week, you can support us on our Patreon, which should be right down here in the description. So please, we need your support. It's going to allow us to do some really cool things, allow us to have great guests on. It's going to allow us to upgrade our digital and physical equipment. And if enough of you join us on Patreon, we are thinking about having special events with you, special episodes, special content, special everything. So please do join us on Patreon. It's just below, down right here. Click. All your support means a lot to you. If you can't spare the extra money, don't worry at all. We still appreciate your support. You know, listening is great support, but you can go an extra mile. You can go in Apple Podcasts, for example, and write a nice review. You can subscribe to the show if you're listening to Spotify. You can share it with friends. Still the best way to spread the podcast. So you can do all these things to keep Uncommon Decency growing and growing. Thanks a lot, Julian, for coming back on the show. Thanks a lot, Jorge, for coming back on the show, but I think you're pretty much obliged to do so. And on that note, I think I can tell to all of you, see you next week.